All right. So art and architecture, particularly architecture, is what I'm focused on here. Is a big one in terms of what's survived in material culture. There's a lot of it, and so it gives us a lot of scope to um, see the ancient world directly, not through any lens, except for the lens of all the millennia that have passed through and often wreaked havoc on the architecture over that time period. All right. So start off with, when we think of Greek buildings, we immediately think of temples. And I'm going to talk like almost exclusively about that. But we need to acknowledge that architecture exists in other forms than simply temples. Because people don't live in temples, they don't work or shop in temples. They don't even get married in temples, by the way. A colleague of mine was working as a consultant to the series Rome, which goes back now at least 20 years. But they were a consultant on that series. And as often happens when classicists are called in to be consultants, they get asked questions that freak them out because they kind of assume that everybody has this very high standard knowledge of the ancient world. And when somebody demonstrates a lower standard, they're like, oh my God, how could you not know that? So for instance, there's a scene where, senator's daughter is marrying a senator's son.
I'm just wondering, it says no one works in the temples. Were there not priests who worked in the temples?
True enough. So you would have a thin slice. Although they didn't tend to be like in the temples themselves working. Yeah, but yes, you're right. There would have been some work going on of a religious nature. Stand corrected. Anyway, they were like, oh yeah, though, we're going to do a wedding scene and it's going to be in the temple. And the class is like, whoa, no, you don't get married in temples. It's not like a church wedding. A wedding, and in ancient Greek world, it was the same, is that there was a wedding party that went to the house of the bride, which was her father's house. And there would be a procession that would go to the groom's house. That was the basics of a wedding. So anyway, yes, daily life doesn't happen in a temple. So just kind of interesting to stop and look at daily life architecture. And the most daily life one is the house itself, right? I talked about how important the oikos was, so we should look at an oikos and see just quickly what a typical Athenian would be living in. So generally speaking, stone foundations, and then mud brick walls and clay roof tiles. So the foundations are the bits that tend to survive. So we have a very good image of the floor plan and the footprint that a house would take up because of that. Very useful. And often built around an inner courtyard. So here is a house, fairly successful individual that's living in this house. You can see it's got, a second story, it's got a lot of rooms. Not everybody would be living this well. And some people would be living better. And a lot of it is stuff that we would expect, right? There's bedrooms, there is a kitchen area. There's a courtyard. So they do have a yard area, but it is very much enclosed within the walls of the house, as opposed to being something on the outside that everybody can technically walk through if they wanted to. Although we're very respectful of people's yards in our society. But the two rooms that jump out at us as different and that we don't experience is a men's room and a woman's room. And that is what they were called. The andron is the men's thing. Actually, it's not even men's room. It's just the men's thing. And the gynaecium, which is the woman's thing. But in the context of a house, when you say thing, you mean room. I don't know if anybody watches Downton Abbey or any of those sort of period shows where after dinner, it's like the men all go off and smoke cigars and drink brandy, and the women go off and drink tea, and then they sort of just talk amongst themselves. It's kind of the same thing here, where, except that it would happen before dinner. So the women tended to all gather together in a space, and it's not random, it's significant that it's on the second floor. So it's very much removed from, it's that extra level of removal from the world around. And the guys are in the men's room. But that doesn't sound right. The men would often, if they were wealthy enough, be looked after by female servants. And so right there, you actually have a situation where female servants who work in a men's space are a little bit suspicious. They're not quite proper women because it's sort of they hang out with the men. Now, they're not hanging out with them, but just because they're in the men's space makes them a little suspicious. So flute girls, for instance, are thought to have done more than just play flutes. Excuse me. So we see everything is kind of what we would expect, except that the genders are very much more separated than we're used to seeing. Another very common bit of architecture is just what you would see in a market. So here is a modern market, farmer's market that's been set up. Here's a recreation of an ancient market that's set up in the Agora. It hasn't really changed very much. It's still temporary stalls or temporary tables where you bring your surplus produce, or you bring what you've made to sell. In the Agora, which is kind of really the downtown core and the commercial core of any community, whether this one happens to be in Athens, because we see the Parthenon, you would have specific market days. So it's not like the shops are open every day, 7 days a week. You'd have particular market days where you would go because you need to get an extra pot, or you need to get a pan, or you need to get spices, whatever. This was a very important part of Greek polis life, particularly, and we're going to talk about particularly Athenian polis life, because it is a very community-focused society. So this is more important to the average Athenian, say, than their home is. I mean, their home is important, but compared to us and the amount of time that you spend in your home compared to the amount of time you spend in this public community space, we spend way more time at home. And when we do spend, if you think about this, when we do spend time outside of our home, it's usually in a very specific place, like here, right? Like in this classroom, or you're going to a specific function, or you're going to a specific store, running a specific errand, that kind of thing. In the ancient Greek world, it's like, okay, on market day, you're going to go to the Agora, and you're going to spend a ton of time there. And it's kind of like your life for that day is, for that entire day is there. You're going to eat there, you're going to go shopping, you're going to talk politics, you're going to meet up with friends. And then you'll only just go home at the end of the day. So it's a very community-focused space for a very community-focused society. And the buildings themselves tend to be public buildings. So there's lots of traffic in and out, as well as throughout the open market space. Couple of government buildings. We talked all about government, and architecture is going to come into that as well. So you've got the Prytaneon. Does anybody remember what the Prytany was? So that's that group of like 50 people who are the hands-on day-to-day managers of the polis or of Athens for that like 36 days of the year when it's their turn. So this is the 50. Remember, the boule is 500, and then it's 1/10 of the year. 50 of them look after the day-to-day running of Athens. And this is how they do it. They actually go and they live in this building for 35, 36 days. And they've got sleeping quarters, they've got kitchens, they have everything they need to keep themselves fed and watered for the month. And when we say kitchens, like you don't have to go and fix your own food, like someone else does that. They actually have people manning the kitchens. And you can see that it is a very communal space. It is not like there are 50 cubicles where you go to sleep. It is very much more a dormitory style of living. And you can, well, if you think about it from just a pragmatic point of view, you get a sense of, and this is where looking at the architecture can help us understand things. There would be a lot of time to just like sit around and chat, because you can't do, it's not like, oh, I'm going to take my cell phone with me and I can do work on the side, or I'm going to take my laptop and I can do work on the side while I'm doing this. Like, you can't do your regular job. All you can do is just stay here and wait for something to happen. And you can imagine that you might have a month go by and nothing happens. And so there isn't any day-to-day work to do. And so you're just hanging out for a month. The other space is the Bouleuterion. Now, who do you imagine, or what group do you think used this space? Actually, they probably were, if they spoke French. But the boule, or the council. So this is the council chambers. So the council is the full 500. So you need to have a space that's big enough for the full council to meet, because something has come up, right? We need to decide, hey, should we send an expedition to Syracuse to conquer that city? So the boule, the 500 get together to decide, okay, are we going to put this forward to the entire assembly of citizens and, basically set the agenda for the meeting and exactly what is the question that's going to be asked, or how are we going to just, should we do this and how many ships, that kind of stuff. So you need space for 500 people to sit down. It's very simple, very functional design, done in, and you notice, like Parliament, how are the Houses of Parliament designed? Anyone? In terms of where the MPs sit. Anyone picture that in their heads?
They're on, like, in the same kind of seating scenario? The speaker looks the same?
Okay, you have the speaker, but is it a horseshoe? Or is it 2 rows? Yeah, it's 2 rows. So it's very adversarial, because basically you have The government on one side and the opposition on the other. Now, it's not quite as neat as that because you've got multi-parties here. This is actually set up more like the U.S. Congress, where it's not set up with the idea that you will have two set established parties on either side fighting or arguing, debating with each other. This is kind of more communal. Everybody is together in a horseshoe group and you're not divided up. I'm sure they did divide themselves up, but it's not set up. And this is it. That's where all the, as I say, all the agendas, everything that is going to go before the assembly, that's where it's decided. That's where it's, okay, this is what we're going to put forward when the assembly meets next week, kind of thing. You notice I didn't have any architecture for the assembly because there is no building for 6,000 people. You might have thought that they might have met, oh, well, maybe they met in the Theater of Dionysus. But in the 5th century BC, the Theater of Dionysus did not exist as a permanent structure. They would just build wooden seating for that, for the performances for that year's festival, and then they would take them down again. It's not until the 4th century BC that they actually build a permanent structure. I didn't also get into all that because when we do theater, we'll look at all the various, how theater evolved from something hyper simple to something hyper complex. So, in case you were looking forward to seeing what theaters looked like, and then I pulled the rug out. But of course, the big thing is temples. Temples are scattered throughout. It's not like they're just on the Acropolis. But the Acropolis gives us an opportunity to see quite a few different temples in a very short space of space. You can see that it's a wide range, right? There are huge temples. There are what's kind of like teeny tiny temples off to the side. They're not all to Athena. It just seems like that. Because you've got the temple of Athena Nike, which is way over here, just in the bottom corner there. Relative to the other temples, that's a very small little temple. That's not going to be one that has a huge congregation of the citizens to it. On the other hand, it's in a very prominent location. It's sort of like the post, the guard post, right as you come onto the Acropolis. You also have temples to local heroes, legendary kings of the past. So you have the Erechtheion for Erechtheus, the Cecropion for Cecrops. These are legendary kings, so it's kind of like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Monument. Yeah.
I noticed like using pillars in the buildings.
Yes. So the architecture, that's a good point. The architecture is very simple, and it is very column-driven, for sure. And
is that a lot of temples? Do they have temples for the minor cities?
yes. And this is it. Like, we're in Athens, so we're seeing temples to Athena. If you go to Sunion, which is at the bottom northeast corner of Attica, you're going to see a massive temple to Poseidon. You go to the Olympic Games, and there is a massive temple to Zeus. And then beside it, there is a slightly less massive temple to Hera, because they had the Olympic Games where Zeus was sort of the presiding deity. They actually also had another games which were only open for women, and where Hera was the presiding deity.
I was thinking more like, I think it's Nike. Nike?
Yeah. Well, there you have. There she is. There. And Nike.
Another of the less, not the Pantheon, but
yeah.
the smaller deities.
Yeah, now in this case, Nike, victory,
Yeah.
is kind of subordinated to Athena. So it's Athena victory. And you would see, actually we'll see it in the Parthenon, you would see Athena holding a figure of winged victory. So they put the two together. Yeah. Yeah, you would see, throughout the countryside, you're going to see little local deities. You'll see a grotto to the nymph of that spring of water. So yes, the architecture for deities, covered the full range from the major deities that we know and we see the fabulous temples right down to like a little grotto with a little altar for a deity or a spirit that was local just to that one spot.
Yeah.
Full range. All right. The crowning jewel on the Parthenon is the Acropolis. There's what it looks like now. There's a reconstruction. I forget where it is in the States. But someone has put forward the money to do that. And so I just want to look at temples in general, and then I want to look at the Parthenon specifically, because the Parthenon is a fairly impressive building. And temples are we see them so much, and they are such a part of our understanding of the Greek world. So there are all kinds of very specific bits that go into a temple. They pretty much all have all of them. It's a very set standard approach, and it does not change much over a long period of time. Centuries go by, they might change the cornice on the top of a column, but that's about it. So bits, I'm not going to talk about every one. You got the column, like you mentioned. The pediment, which is basically the triangle area at the top as you go in, but it's also, there's another pediment in the back door facing the opposite direction.
Should we remember these terms for the midterm?
Yeah, the ones that I highlight. If I don't put a little circle around it, then you don't have to worry about it. Triglyphs and metopes. I just love that, triglyphs and metopes. The frieze, which we can't see here so well, you can see it's highlighted, but that's something that's inside the building. It's not outside. And we're standing outside right now. You can see there are a lot of other things. There's always a statue of the god or goddess, which is in the center area. There is after you get around all these columns, there is something called the naos. And that is basically the room. That's the temple bit itself. Everything else is just kind of added foofara, where but it starts off with, you've got a room. Then you build these columns, you create this roof structure on top. And the area where the columns are, where you see it's called a stoa, that is kind of a public area. It's not particularly a sacred area. So that's an area where you could go and get out of the sun or get out of the rain. It was often an area where if the temple was in a more public area, not up on the Acropolis, because you don't go up to the Acropolis and hang out there, but a temple that's in the Agora or just off the Agora, the stoa is a place where people will gather. There is a whole branch of philosophy that is named after this bit of a temple. Stoicism. The Stoics are basically the people who hang out in the stoa. That's what it is. When Zeno would talk philosophy with his students. That's what they did. They would go to an area that is protected, that is, a couple of rows of columns. Yeah. So it's a very public space for a community that is very public, community minded. So. And then, like I say, there is the statue, which is the focal point. So if a temple is being used as a treasury, the treasury is actually in a little room in behind the statue of the goddess. So it's not easily accessible. If you're hanging out in the stoa, you can't get at it, for instance. All right. So that's a general look of a temple. One thing that will change over time, you notice it says a Greek Doric temple. This part here, the top of the column, which is called the cornice, depending on how fancy that is, changes the style of the column and then the name of the temple. So if it is a bit more elaborate, a bit fancier, it's referred to as an Ionic column. And so it's an Ionic temple. If it is really like over the top fancy, it looks like this massive flower pot with tons of sculpture around it. That's a Corinthian column, and it's a Corinthian temple. But everything else stays the same. There's nothing else. It still has the statue. It still has the pediment. Still has triglyphs head base. It's just that they change the top of the column, and suddenly you're in a totally different temple. Anyway, that's a very simplistic way to look at it. Now, we can look at all these elements and bits of a temple at work looking at the Parthenon. This is like our case study for how temples are structured and what you see when you walk up to and walk into a temple. So the first part with the Parthenon is you have the pediments. So the pediments are these triangle shapes at the top. And again, that architectural feature goes back, if you remember, to Mycenaean gates, right? The triangle at the Lion's Gate, where you have the two lions sort of rampant to take some of the pressure off of the lintel and put it onto the posts. We're going to see a lot of horror vacui here, because if you have a space, you should decorate it. You shouldn't just leave it blank. So here we have the pediments on the east and west face. So the front door of the temple and then the back door of the temple. Don't know if anybody has enough myth in their back pocket to have a go at guessing what is being depicted here, because there is a specific scene or act that's being depicted in each of these.
The hierarchy.
Well, there certainly is. And actually, that's a good thing to point out. There is definitely a hierarchy because you're dealing with a triangle. So as you go down to the ends, the less important stuff is happening and people are smaller and they're lying down or they're reclining or whatever, or you only see their heads. And so the important stuff has to happen in the middle.
Can you guess the lower one?
Yep.
Is that the contest between Athena and Poseidon?
Yes, it is. So there you've got Poseidon and Athena competing to who gets to be the patron of Athens. Poseidon has his trident there. Athena is a woman dressed all in armor. And in between them is the olive tree that won the contest.
Athena gave the olive tree, Poseidon gave the salt water spring.
Yes.
And that Athens decided the olive tree was a
Yeah.
better gift.
Which suggests that Salt Spring Island should be should build a temple to Poseidon. Yeah.
I was going to guess the bottom.
Okay, and the same. Yeah. Anybody on the top one? That's a tougher one because they have to depict the scene after the act has happened because you can't depict it very well.
Is that the birth of Athena?
Yeah, it is. It's the birth of Athena. So the guy sitting down there is Zeus. Athena has just been born, fully grown, fully armed. Of course, the Greeks know the story so well that they don't have any problem identifying it. For us, the hint that we're looking at that is this character here who's carrying an axe, because he just chopped Zeus's head open to allow Athena to pop out. Anybody who did myth with me, like there's so many depictions of this little Athena popping out of the head of Zeus on pottery. It's not easy to depict a full-grown person coming out of someone's head. They manage to do it. Sometimes it's not the most elegant. Sometimes they do a pretty good job. They didn't even bother trying. This is post-birth. Anyway, as I say, you have the main scene. You probably have just room for 2 main characters. And then everything else works off of that until you have like either people lying down, or you've got a horse's head, or you've got something there. You have to have something there. You couldn't have just left that little triangle blank. Absolutely not. That's not how we do art if we are in 5th century Athens. So another one, again, I love the name of this, Triglyphs and Metopes. I know, to me that would be a great title for a novel. So these are little individual scenes. They're small. There's not a lot of space for a metope. So in this case, for instance, it's showing not the battle of the Lapiths and the centaurs. It's just showing a Lapith and a centaur fighting as a small little vignette of the entire scene. Here we have, and this you get a sense of the range. The metopes do not necessarily have a theme where, okay, we're going to show just things to do with Athena, or we're going to just show heroic deeds of Heracles. It's just a little scene, 2 or 3 characters, and then the next one. So here we've got, the one is Hercules and the Kerkopes, which is for us, not a particularly central story about Hercules, but it's where he overcomes 2 twins and then carries them off. And part of the story is that he carries them off upside down, and they start laughing, even though he's defeated them. And he's like, what's so funny here, guys? And they say, well, we had a prophecy that we would be overcome by somebody who had a black bottom. And Heracles wore a lion skin. So the lion's head was here, and then the lion's skin was like that. It didn't cover his backside, so because his backside was in the sun all the time, it was particularly dark. And then, so as they're being carried like that, and they're sort of face having to look at his bum, then okay, yeah, we did get conquered by somebody with a dark backside. But here we have the killing of Medusa, which is not done by Heracles at all. In between each of these scenelets, you can see this pattern of, it almost looks like little mini columns. And how many? It's 3. So if you ever wonder, it's like, okay, how can I tell the difference between a triglyph and a metope? Well, this 3 structure and the tri just means 3 stones. It's a little mini triple column. And then the metope is the actual carved scene. So this is what it looks like. So we saw a close-up. This is what it looks like in the wild. If you are in, it's let me think. When did the got to pick the right date? I almost picked the date too soon before the Parthenon was finished. It's 420. It's 410 BCE, and you're walking through the Acropolis. This is how you would see the scenelets, and that's you would see the triglyphs and metopes, obviously in a little bit better condition. Now, here's the question, because this is you've got the columns, then you have the basically the lintel across, then you've got the triglyphs and metopes, and then above that you have the pediment. Incredible detail, like getting the hair, the carving of the hair, the musculature of the horse. The detail is quite incredible. Who can see this?
Not people.
No, unless you've got amazing eyesight. This is all of this work is really for the benefit of. Yeah, it's for the benefit of Athena. It's for the benefit of the god or goddess whose temple this is. I suppose you could be cynical and say it's also for the benefit of the carver who gets paid to do all this work as well. But yeah, it is not particularly for the benefit of the people walking around.
Would scenes have to be carefully picked from mythology or legend to not depict something that's offensive to the deity? So, say when Arachne challenges Athena,
Yeah.
that scene, I'm guessing, wouldn't be on a temple to Athena.
That's a really good question. Is the selection process?
Yeah.
And in fact, like having been involved in projects, there is a whole decision making, and it's like, do they just leave it to the artists and say, yeah, just put whatever you want, or they say, well, no, we want to have this, but then there is some brain or group of brains that are deciding, okay, this is what we want to have. And often there is a theme. It might be a general theme of conquering wild animals or conquering monsters. Typically, the themes are ones that are going to reflect on the city particularly. So they'll want to be relevant. The one thing that came up was Phidias was the name of the sculptor who oversaw the work. Obviously, he didn't carve every single thing, but he was the director, and he did do a lot of the carving, specifically, particularly the statue. He was accused of sneaking his face into one of the characters that was portrayed, and which would have been considered an act of sacrilege to do that. But then you'd have to prove that was willfully done. It was really just a matter of Phidias is working under, the name will come to me in a minute, Pericles. So he's kind of a protege. Pericles is his patron. We can't attack Pericles, but we'll attack people that work under him or who work with him. So that was the sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, metope, and so the triglyph is the three stones. Inside, you have the pediment. Looks pretty impressive, but it's in fact the frieze that is the big show here. This runs on the inside the entire circumference of the inner part of the temple, not the outer part. And it would have one long, I'm going to say this right, it was one long continuous sculpture. And in this case, and in a lot of cases, it was it was creating the closest thing you could create to video using static sculpture. So what it would do is it would create different points of time in a given action. So in this case, it's called the Panathenaic frieze, and it depicts the Panathenaic procession, which is the great procession in honor of Athena. And what it is the centerpiece of the procession is this peplos, which has been woven by specially chosen young women of aristocratic birth. And it is taken to the statue of Athena in her temple. The old peplos is removed, and this new peplos is put on, which is kind of like a long gown type dress. The peplos appears at several points in the frieze, not because they made multiple peploi, but simply because they're showing it at different points during the procession. And the procession starts with like the horses gathering at the beginning of the thing, and then all the way to the last part where the peplos is sort of being presented to the goddess. It is either an idealized depiction of the Panathenaic procession, or it is the first Panathenaic procession, or a combination of both. So like here, that's an early scene where the horsemen are getting sort of galloping off to the Panathenaic procession. Here we have the peplos, and it's actually depicted 3 times. The person is carrying it on her head. Then you can see the person is in the process of handing it off to someone else. And then you have the peplos being given to the Archon Basileus by the woman who was specifically chosen for the honor of that role in the ceremony. Preparing the peplos. You can see it's being very carefully folded. So again, the architecture tells us how important what the details were in the ceremony and how important they were. Like getting every part exactly right really mattered. There is where it is relative to the building. So you can see we're on the absolute outside. We're looking up and we see, oh yeah, there's my triglyphs and metapies. And then the inside row of columns, that's where the Panathenaic frieze is hanging out. There's another way to see it. So there you can see a recreation of the front of the temple, where it's like you walk up the steps, you've got the first row of columns with the pediment, triglyphs, and metapies. Then you've got the second row of columns with the Panathenaic frieze, and then you have the actual temple walls and the door leading into the sanctuary itself. By the way, interesting little detail, the carving was done in situ. So it wasn't like I've got this metapie and I'm going to carve it here and then they will lift it up by crane, which they had, into position. No, the stone would be there in position and then you would have scaffolding and you would be doing the work up on the scaffold.
That sounds dangerous.
It does, and I don't think they had work-safe Athens.
What if they make a mistake? They just have to.
That's a very good question. Because it's like, I mean, I suppose it would depend on the level of the mistake. If you think about it, you've got a number of stone cutters, and stone cutting was there were a lot of stone cutters in Athens. Socrates, that was his job, because he actually did have a job besides going around and annoying people. and that was as a stone cutter. He evidently wasn't very successful at it, because we have references to his wife getting after him for spending too little time at his job, and yes, and too much time just hanging out in the agora and in the stoa. Undoubtedly, for something that this major, you're going to get the good ones, right? The state is going to fork out to have the high quality guys. A lot of the stone cutting that's done is a much more functional stone cutting where if you make a mistake, you just, actually, an analogy I can think of is if you go to some small town or small community and you look at the tombstones from 150 years, 200 years in the past, you will see a surprising number of mistakes where they didn't have the money to, oh, I've got to get another stone or I'm going to have to charge them for it. They would just either leave it or they would, like I've seen, they're carving, they get to the end of the line and they realize they've left out a word and they just stick it in there with a little hatch, right? Like when you're doing notes. Oh, I forgot that. There it is. One that I used to live in a small town in Ontario, across the street from a cemetery, and there's a stone that the name Jesus is misspelled, and they just left it. They didn't bother trying to correct it, anything like that at all. So there's the lower level of people who do this job, and they were not the ones who were invited to take on this project. Anyway, so like I say, they're working up on scaffolding. Now, this is the bit that my wife finds the most fun. The Parthenon has a lot of something called a trompe-l'oeil. I don't know if anybody has heard that term before. Anyone? So a trompe-l'oeil is a trick of the eye. It is where you are shown something and it isn't actually what you're seeing. So here's just a number of examples, and I put in this many just because they're fun, right? Okay, it's stuff like this. Right? This is a good one. The boy coming out of the frame. And again, a lot of it is done with perspective, messing around with our perception of 3D, and we finish up with Escher's Impossible Staircase, which people either love this one or they find it deeply disturbing that you've got these people perpetually walking upstairs and never getting anywhere. Anyway, all tricks of the eye. They look real, but they don't actually exist. At least the thing that you are seeing doesn't exist. Anyway, what you see is not what you get. The Parthenon is an ancient monument to tricks of the eye. And these are what they are. So for instance, you would expect the columns would all be equidistant. They're all straight up and down, and the ground is flat. And none of that exists. The columns are not straight, they're cigar-shaped. The pediment is not straight. It is not a perfectly straight triangle. It has a curve in it, slightly dome-shaped. The columns also are not straight. They lean slightly inwards. And I mean not inwards into the temple, inwards into the center. So if you're standing at the front, they actually lean a little bit towards each other. And they're not evenly spaced. The columns at the ends are a little bit further away, and the columns in the center, if you're standing again looking at the front door, are a little further away from each other. Anybody think why you would do all this stuff?
To affect the way someone sees it. It looks bigger when you walk up to it.
Yes, and there's one other reason why you do all this, because it's a lot of fiddly work. It is The columns are not, the columns are cigar shaped, so they will appear straight because of the way light refracts. If you made them perfectly straight, they would actually look concave. If you made the pediment exactly straight, it would look droopy. And it's just basically, it's understanding maybe not light refraction in all its wonderful details. It's just knowing, okay, if I do this, I'm going to get that effect. So I'm going to okay, if I counteract it, it will look straight, but only if I do this. And it's the same thing. The columns at the ends, if you have them spaced the same, they will look farther apart because, again, the way light refracts around stuff. So all of this, all these irregularities combine to make the temple look absolutely straight, perfect lines. Perfectly straight here, perfectly straight there. Everything looks exactly equidistant. And so that was obviously extremely important. You want the columns to all look perfectly straight and perfectly straight up and down. And you're willing to go to all this effort and figuring out how to make them look straight up and down when you know they won't look that way. So, a lot of work. Another thing that we see quite a bit of, and I'm doing this from an architectural point of view, is statuary. So here we have caryatids. You may remember the very first lecture had one of the very first slides was caryatids. Basically, they are statues of women that serve as columns. So you can see that this little portico is being held up by columns, but they are disguised as statues. This is probably the most well-known one. It is on the porch of the temple to the legendary King Erechtheus, again on the Acropolis. In general, and we're looking at caryatids now, but we could be looking at any kind of statuary, and we're going to see it when we look at other statues for the rest of the course. That they are realistic depictions of people. They're not stylized. They're not abstracted at all. They're very, compared to some of the early statuary and some of the early figures we saw, which were highly stylized, there was no attempt to create a realistic looking human being. Here, there is enormous effort to create the most realistic figure you possibly can, but it is idealized. You're not going to, have somebody who doesn't have sort of the ideally perfect features. And the level of detail is huge, not just on the facial figures or the body shape, but things like the drapery of the clothing, where you're basically taking stone and really making it look like flowing cloth. Or the details of the hairstyle. Like, that is an incredible amount of detail. And you're multiplying it over all the statues in a given temple. The other thing that we have to remember is that all of this stuff, which looks like pristine white marble, and our aesthetic is, oh, this marble is really an attractive stone on its own right. So we just want to have like a nice, clean, white figure or countertop or whatever we use marble for. We don't imagine that you would ever paint it. That seems hideous by our aesthetics. But in fact, for the ancient Greeks, marble was like paper. Clean white paper where we can now put some color on it, right? It's the canvas to put the color on. And so we can tell even after this remove, oh yeah, there's like little tiny scrapes of color in all those folds of hair or drapery or in the eye area, the facial features, that these were all absolutely fully colored. If you're skeptical about that and find it hard to believe that they would have splashed all this color on this lovely, pure marble, one of the criticisms about Athens when it had done all this tremendous building program with all this money that was pouring in because they were like the lead defenders against the Persian invasion, was that Athens was now painted up to look like a prostitute. So clearly it was not all white marble, if that was the attitude that people had. It was like all of these public buildings, the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena Nike, all of these buildings had tons of color. And I think, like, by our standards, it's like, I think we'd be overwhelmed by it. Even, it's not just that, well, we expected it to be white. We didn't expect all these colors. But compared to what we have nowadays, we tend to have, like in the West Coast here, it's all about very muted, understated, low-key colors. It's not big and splashy like that. The centerpiece of the whole thing is they call it the cult statue, but I try to avoid the word cult because it makes it sound like some sort of weird side group. Cult just comes from the Latin word to honor or to actually cultivate. The Temple of Athena Parthenos was not considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but it might well have been, because the same person who carved this statue carved the statue of Zeus at Olympia, and that was considered one of the forgot the word I was looking for. Wonders of the ancient world.
Is the statue missing? Because I feel like I've heard that, like the original statue.
Yeah, no, the statue is long gone, unfortunately. It is absolutely crammed with imagery. Again, we think of something that's fairly simple, but we do have depictions of Athena, and so we know what it would have looked like. We also have descriptions, so we have a pretty good idea of what the original looked like. And this is it. It's crammed with stuff. The one statue there, you can see she's holding a shield. In behind the shield, there's a snake. She has horses on her helmet, which was not like, oh, you mean the Greeks put little statues of horses on their helmets when they went to battle? No, they didn't. This is just on Athena's helmet. Again, our taste might say this was excessive, but the idea is that there are a number of aspects of Athena that you want to acknowledge, you want to promote, you want to communicate to the viewer, and you don't leave anything out. So there's a creation of the statue as it existed in the Parthenon. And again, it's based on how we know Athena is portrayed. It's based on descriptions that we have in the ancient world. Anybody have any immediate reaction?
Very, very bright gold.
Yes, it's Trumpian gold. It's actually called a chryselephantine statue. So it basically is the gold and ivory statue. Elephantine is the Greek word for ivory, and chrysos is gold, by Phidias. So the statue itself, it's not like solid gold. Phew. But it is, it's actually a wooden substructure. And then you have the stonework done on top of that. And then you have the gold foil or gold leaf is pounded on, and ivory where appropriate. The amount of decoration is huge because you notice she's standing on a pedestal, and the pedestal has its own scene in front of it. Just to give you an idea of you don't leave an empty space. So she's standing on kind of platform shoes. It has quite a high sole. There are carvings on the side of her shoes. That is how you never let empty space go begging. You can also see it's massive.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how tall is it?
Well, there is a person standing. That's a human being standing beside it. So that gives you, and they're there solely to give you the perspective. But you can see it's 2 rows of columns. Like, it is huge, and it would have been assembled inside. You could not like move it in. Okay, we're going to put it in. That would make a good cartoon, right? And they build the cul-de-sac. It's like, oops, we forgot. How are we going to get this inside? It was assembled inside. Anyway, by the numbers, so it was constructed between 447 and 438 BC, so it took 9 years. The statue itself was 11 meters high, and it contained 1,100 kilograms of gold and ivory. So very high end. In fact, and I mentioned about Phidias being, it's like, oh, I can't really attack Pericles, he's way too popular, but I can attack Phidias. Phidias was charged with embezzlement, that he had pocketed some of the gold that he'd requisitioned for the statue and kept it. And if you look at it, it's like, well, how can you prove that every ounce of gold that he requisitioned for the statue is on the statue? And what he did was he took it all off, had it weighed, compared that to the requisition forms, and proved that every ounce of gold that he had been provided for the statue was on the statue. It weighed, it balanced out. So that's how we know how much gold was on there. And also gives you an idea, again, we look at this and we marvel at this artist's technical ability and this fabulous achievement. That's not how the ancient Greeks saw artisans. Artisans were surprisingly low down on the social scale. They were, we'd be like, wow, like this guy would be, this great master. That wasn't the case. Artisans were looked upon almost like wage slaves, right? They don't own farms. They don't get their wealth, and they're standing from the traditional places where we like to see it. So, a bit disappointing. Anyway, the cost of this was 5,000 talents, and a talent, my own thumbnail evaluation of a talent was about $250,000, but that was something that I put together about 40 years ago, or even 35 years ago. So we're talking, that's very expensive. Very, very expensive for one talent. So then do the math. And $250,000 is old. It's old. We've had like 30 years of inflation since then. So I think the buying power of a talent now is a lot more than it was back then. And that pedestal that you saw that she's standing on, this is the recreation of it, and that it depicted the birth of Pandora, interestingly enough. Anyway, some other little bits and pieces of art and architecture to see us out the door. We've seen a lot of art on the sides of sculptures. We keep seeing the large amphora, things like that. I just wanted to show something that's a lot more decorative, a lot finer, daintier work. But you can see it's very fine work, done at a pretty high standard. Lots of grave steles, where you're seeing this. It's called relief sculpture, by the way. When you have, it's not a freestanding statue. It is something that is just coming out of the stone like that. And here, so this is a private piece of art. It's not the Parthenon, but the person who executed and did this work, still a pretty decent level. If we're going to critique it, there's not nearly as much garment flowing. It's not as complex a garment. It's a lot simpler, but you're still seeing the flow there. Same with the hair. Here's some jewelry. I like this one, a gold ring, and that is Hermes. And again, it's very tiny, fine work that's been done there, but it's not crude by any means. Anyone guess what this is? It's hard to tell because of the patina, because it's bronze.
Is it a mirror?
It's totally a mirror. And it wouldn't function very well as a mirror now because it doesn't have a silver glass. It is basically, you just polish the hell out of the bronze until you get the reflection. So you can't use it now because it's gone green. But if you polished it up, it could actually function the way it was intended to.